Congratulations. After almost, what, now 5, 6 months of virtual education, we have reached the final time period of AP World History, where we start into the 20th and going into the 21st century. So, as we begin this period of time from 1900 to the present, the first unit, Unit 7, is going to focus on global conflicts. We're going to focus particularly on World War I, World War II, but also on the interwar years. This lecture is going to focus on World War I and the beginnings of World War I, as well as a little bit of an overview of what 1900 looks like. So, a little bit of the events before World War I, and then we'll get into the beginnings of World War I. So, the first thing we want to talk about is the shifting power after 1900 concept. So, in AP World History, the very first topic of Unit 7 talks about how power is shifting in 1900. We want to start first with the basic premise that the West is in a superior position in 1900. So you have Western presence across the globe dominating throughout Africa, throughout Asia, throughout Latin America. And when we talk about the West, of course, we're talking about Europe and the United States, and we can also put in Japan. And the primary reason for that supremacy is the impact of industrialization and how industrialization in particular allows for the mass production of manufactured goods, particularly weapons. The other thing that the Industrial Revolution did was it allowed for the scientific leaps that would lead to the improvement in weapon technology. So the two reasons for the supremacy is one, the industrialized process, and then two, the military technology advancements that are being made very rapidly at the end of the 19th century. And that puts the West in a position of supremacy. Well, what's going to happen over the course of the 1900s is that the West is going to lose that supremacy. World War I is going to be the first blow. The Great Depression will be the second blow. And then the third blow will be World War II. And the political dominance of the West throughout the globe is going to be shaken because of these three primary events. So, the other thing we want to focus on in terms of general change over the 20th century is the end of the concept of an empire. Basically, what we're going to watch over the 20th century is that this model of governing that we've been looking at all throughout history, the empire, which rules over a diverse group of people under one centralized rule, is going to come to an end for the most part. And while there will still be influence, we won't have that type of imperial model for much longer throughout the 20th century. And what will happen is that the world will change into smaller nation states. So, for number two, the basic concept is that we're going to shift from these overseas and land based empires that we looked at throughout the last time period. We're going to see them start breaking up into smaller nation states, setting up the map we see today in the globe. So that brings me to letter B. In a lot of ways, this is a review of things we touched on last unit. But for whatever reason, AP World puts this into this part of the curriculum. So three land-based empires are going to be challenged before World War I or during World War I. So in the first 20 years, we're going to watch three traditional land-powered or land-based empires fall apart. One of these is the Qing Empire in China. Now, for the Qing Empire, we talked already about the revolution of 1911 under Dr. Sun Yat-sen and how that ends the Manchu dynasty and establishes a republic and begins an attempt at westernizing China. And we'll talk more about China very specifically as we go through this last unit. But with the Qing Empire, what you want to realize is that the Qing Empire was facing internal problems, such as the rebellions that were taking place in response to the idea that the West or the Manchu had become weak. We also have ethnic tensions, which is an important thing to keep in mind with the Qing Empire, is that religious and ethnic minorities were pushing back against a ruling class that had suppressed these groups. Now, when I say minorities, I'm really talking about more the power structure than the numbers, because for China, the majority of the Chinese at this time were from the Han ethnicity. But the Manchu ethnicity is the one who held the power and were able to suppress this ethnic group of the Han. That tension, that ethnic tension, boils over in part through the revolution of 1911. China is also facing external challenges, which we talked about with imperialism, with the influence of Western powers, as well as Japan that we saw in the Opium Wars, that we saw, through the suppression of the Taiping Rebellion and the Boxer Rebellion. So the Western involvement in Chinese markets and the Western dominance of Chinese markets, coupled with internal um, resistance popping up amongst the Han Chinese, is going to lay the foundations for the revolutions of 1911. And the Qing Empire will never come back, but the whole imperial model is going to be weakened throughout China. Russia, we're going to talk about this more in the next lecture, but Russia is going to undergo a revolution, the Russian Revolution of 1917. And to make matters simple for you, this is where there's a communist revolution that overthrows the government of Russia and brings in a communist form of government. And that is a kind of an example of where the world shook from this particular revolution. And this is going to inform a lot of the 20th century's happenstances. But Russia also is experiencing internal conflict. You have a czarist regime who is not responsive to the people's needs. We have underdevelopment in terms of industrial development. And Russia, as an economic power, is lagging behind considerably Britain, France, and Germany. So those internal problems, the refusal to deal with the people's demands, to make the necessary reforms to kind of modernize Russia, creates a revolutionary class within Russia. And then there are external problems. Russia, by 1917, had lost already two wars. One, the Crimean War in 1853 to 1856, and then two, the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 and 1905. And on top of that, you look at the year 1917, that's in the middle of World War I. And the war was not going well for Russia either. So these external pressures, particularly of Russia's struggling to perform well during wars, contributes to the revolution as well. But again, we'll talk more about that. Then finally, the Ottoman Empire. You may remember that the Ottoman Empire was undergoing a transition where they were bringing in a constitutional form of government that resulted ultimately in the Young Turk movement of 1908. But the other thing we want to see is that the Ottoman Empire is undergoing a rise in ethnic nationalist groups breaking away. So the Ottoman Empire is dealing with nationalism. Nationalism is eroding the unity of the empire. And states like Greeks and Serbia are starting to break away from the Ottoman Empire, weakening it. The Young Turks were trying to save the Ottoman Empire. And one of the things that the Young Turks will do is put into practice a Turkification, where they're going to try and impose the Turkish culture, the Turkish language, the Turkish traditions, the Turkish customs, the Turkish dress. They attempt to impose that on everybody left in the Ottoman Empire. And that's not going to sit well with the non-Turks, such as the Arabs, but also the Armenian Christians, which is going to play out into World War I. By the end of World War I, the Ottoman Empire is going to cease to exist. And a lot of the contribution to that end deals with the growth of ethnic nationalism within its borders. So that's something we're going to be talking about in more detail. Not so much the Qing, because we already did that. Definitely talk more about Russia and the Ottomans when we deal with the effects of World War I. Then lastly, we're going to see several examples of challenges to the existing political and social order. Again, this is something we touched on throughout imperialism, where nationalist movements are forming in response to the state building of the Europeans and the United States. One of the things that we can look at is the Mexican Revolution, which we talked about in the last lecture of Unit 6, or 2 lectures before the end of Unit 6. And in the case of the Mexican Revolution, you had a dictator named Diaz who was seen as giving the foreign investors, particularly the United States and European investors, too much resources of Mexico and neglecting the poor and the lower class of Mexico. In other words, Diaz was more concerned with the foreign investors and making sure they were happy than serving the needs of the people. And the way he dealt with this protests of his ways of governing was through brutal methods of imprisonment, of execution, of arrests, and political persecution, which is going to radicalize the revolutionary movement. It's going to focus around the idea of land reform. And that push for land reform, that push to force the Diaz government to get the foreign entities out and to pay more attention to the lower class, will spark that Mexican Revolution of 1910. Power will exchange hands many times. In the end, there will be a constitution of 1917 which attempts to reform Mexico in response to Diaz's policies, or to get rid of Diaz's policies. But the conflict will continue on. And at the center of that will be an issue of land distribution. What's interesting is we want to keep an eye on that land redistribution as we go forward, because not only will we see that issue in Mexico, we will also see it in Russia and we'll see it in China as sticking points that is going to cause further turmoil down the road. So that's your shifting power after 1900. And again, we know a lot of this already, and a lot of this is not anything new, but we just want to pay attention to it because that's what the curriculum asks for. So now we come to World War One, and what we're going to focus on with World War One in this lecture are the main long-term causes. So you'll see that the word main is capitalized, and that's because main is going to serve as an acronym to remember the 4 long-term causes. The first is militarism. So militarism is when a society builds up its military. It's when a government or a country pursues the policy of enlarging its military capacity. And in this case, we can see a rivalry forming between Germany and Britain. At the end of this lecture, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail as an option, but suffices to say, in the 1890s, Germany and the leader of Germany, a Kaiser named Wilhelm II, wanted to increase the power and prestige of Germany. And to him, the country that needed to be knocked off was Britain. So Germany and Britain are going to form this rivalry starting in the 1890s. And they're competing for supremacy, they're competing for superiority. And one of the ways this competition plays out is through a naval race. So if you jump ahead to the 1960s, you may remember from US history that the US and the Soviet Union engaged in a space race. We also engaged in a missile race. We engaged in an arms race. What Germany and Britain is doing is exactly the same thing. Britain has always dominated the seas with its powerful navy. In the 1890s, Germany starts to build up that navy of theirs, which makes Britain respond by building up their navy. So what's happening is that Germany and Britain are getting into a competition with one another, which we refer to as a naval race, which is just a arms race for the stuff you use on the seas. And in the 1890s, whoever controlled the seas controlled the globe. So that's not a trivial competition. Second, all throughout Europe, we see an increased government spending on the military. Because of industrialization, the mass production of ammunition, the mass production of weapons is much cheaper, which leads to an increase in the amount of weapons being produced. And also, if you can produce uniforms much cheaper, you can produce the equipment much cheaper, then you can supply and equip a larger army. So all across Europe, you have an increase in the number of soldiers that are employed by the government. But not only is the military increasing, but the attitude towards the military is changing as well. The military is becoming more and more glorified throughout the 19th into the 20th century. And we're seeing much more of a militarized society. And I'm going to give you two examples to further go into this point. One is that the attitude was that every young boy should be trained to be a potential soldier. So even though that young boy might turn into a man who doesn't volunteer for the national army, there was still the belief that everyone, every boy, needed to be armed with the skills necessary to win out on a potential war. One of the ways of training young boys in this case was to put them into youth sports. And in a lot of ways, in the late 19th century into the earlier 20th century, the idea of youth sports organizations grew and developed. And the attitude was by teaching, particularly young boys, not that girls weren't doing sports, but it was more driven to the boys, by teaching the boys of society concepts of teamwork, how to compete against your opponent, physical health. You would be creating a generation that could protect the nation in the future. And oftentimes with youth sports of the 1890s, 1900s, that was the attitude, was to train the boys physically and mentally to deal with any conflicts that might arise later. A second example of this type of training we see in the United States as the Boy Scouts. So if you know anything about the Boy Scouts organization, you know that it has a history of emphasizing wilderness survival skills, how to camp in the wilderness, how to fish, how to use a compass to orient yourself. And even though today there's a greater focus on community service for the Cub Scouts and the Boy Scouts, back in 1910, the Boy Scouts were definitely teaching kids how to be soldiers if they should ever be in that situation. And it wasn't just the United States doing this, but there was also Britain, Germany, France, many of the European countries had youth organizations that, in a sense, were teaching these kids how to belong to a military unit. Those attitudes, that all fits into militarism as well. And what it does is it emphasizes this idea of competition, that you are in competition with these other countries. And if you're not strong, you will be conquered. So you have that attitude of militarism that is developed throughout the 19th century. And by the 20th century, this is just the way it is. And the other part is that the military life is being romanticized. There's an attitude that the military is a force of good and that war is diplomacy by other means. In other words, having a war with a foreign country isn't necessarily going to devastate society. Now we come to alliances. Now, to me, the alliances are the critical factor that makes World War One World War One. And basically, to make a long story short, we have two systems of alliances. On one side is the Triple Entente, Russia, Britain, and France coming together as allies. Now, a lot of this, if you look at the 1800s, this would be an unusual alliance. In the Crimean War, Britain and France fought against Russia. Britain and France have been historically rivals. For example, the Seven Years' War and the Battle of Plassey in India, which was part of the Seven Years' War, but also throughout the African expansion, Britain and France sometimes had skirmishes that could have led to outright war if cooler heads hadn't prevailed. What really pulls this triple entente together is the aggressiveness of Germany. Germany's aggressiveness leads Britain and France to become rivals, and Germany's siding with Austria puts Russia in need of an ally, which pulls Russia into this triple entente. On the other side is the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria, and Italy. And really, what we want to keep in mind is that it's really Germany and Austria. Italy and France, they have rivalries, they have issues they need to work out. So Italy sides with Germany because Germany's against France. But Austria and Germany are longtime allies. They have a great deal in common. And they've been allies since German unification in 1866, 67. They formed a treaty. And that treaty committed Germany and Austria to each other's interests. And by 1910, Germany has become so aggressive that really the only country that stands by it is Austria. Even Italy is lukewarm to Germany. And that's going to play into our story later. What the alliances ideally do is they create a balance of power. They make it very clear that a conflict should be avoided because it would have disastrous results. And the hope was by creating these alliances, you would have a balance of power throughout Europe and keep this competition from blowing up into a full-scale war. However, the danger is if one of those countries thinks it's winnable, then a fight will quickly draw in everybody. So all we need is some type of conflict between two of the countries of Europe, and very quickly that small conflict will pull everybody in. And that is exactly what's going to happen with World War One. The third one, the I in Maine, can stand for imperialism or industrialization. So the idea is that World War One wouldn't be the war if it wasn't as industrialized as it was. In other words, you can't have World War One like we do without an industrial society. And what's interesting, and I put this in there just so you keep it in mind, and we'll talk more about this in the next lecture. The idea is that an industrial society is capable of a war at a whole different level was not something people thought would happen in 1914 on the eve of World War One. In fact, the belief was that Europe was progressing to a point of human understanding that in a sense would take humanity to another level. And what World War One does is it shatters that optimism. So in the 19th century, science and industrialization, that was believed to progress mankind. And yet World War One becomes the most devastating war mankind has ever inflicted. So that's the industrialization part. The imperialism part, there's two examples. You can understand how imperialism would lead to competition over territory as well as markets between the European states and the United States, but mostly the European states. But what I want to do is look at two examples of imperialistic interests. One is Russia versus Austria over the Ottoman lands. So if you remember from the last slide, the Ottoman Empire is falling apart. Those movements of ethnic nationalism is starting to tear apart the Ottoman Empire. The lands that are coming out as a result, Russia and Austria are competing over those lands for influence, if not colonization. So one of those pieces of lands is, or actually one of those regions, is called the Balkans, Balkans. The Balkans that we're going to focus on are countries today such as Serbia, Bosnia, which is called Bosnia Herzegovina, Serbia, Bosnia, and Croatia, but also Montenegro, Kosovo. That region, which used to be Yugoslavia when I was growing up, that becomes a bone of contention between Russia and Austria. They're both seeking to expand their influence into that region. The other one is German intervention in British affairs. Britain is going to have conflicts in Africa, such as the Boer War. And the Germans decide to show up and declare their support for the Boers. There's going to be an incident in Morocco where there's a revolution against France, and Germany will show up and say, "We support the rebels against France." And by that point, France and Britain are allies. Germany's doing this because of a militaristic policy that's being set by their Kaiser. He wants to challenge Britain. And what's happening is Germany is forcing themselves in to British imperial affairs, which is going to increase the tension between Germany and Britain. Finally, we have nationalism. And I think the Germany's rise versus British supremacy, I don't need to redo that because that idea that Germany is motivated by this desire to be number one, that's driven and focused in nationalism. And the British response to that is to see a threat. And so, out of concerns of protecting the British interests, they respond by seeing Germany as a threat, which increases tensions. We'll talk more about that in the next slide. Finally, we get to Serbia. Now, Serbia is where all the action is. So, going into the Balkans, what's happening is that Serbia as a nation is trying to unify together the Slavic people, Slavic, I see. And we call this movement Pan-Slavism. So you have to imagine that as the Ottoman Empire is falling apart in the Balkans, which has historically been a different ethnic group than the Ottoman Empire. They are Christian, there's Slavic people, there's Croatians, so on and so forth. But what the Serbians want to do is take the Slavic people and unite them together as one nation. So there's a unification movement going on by Serbia. A big piece of land that Serbia wants to get its hands on is called Bosnia. And Bosnia is controlled by Austria. So what happens is that this bone of contention is between Austria and Serbia, and that bone of contention is Bosnia. Leading up to World War One, there had been conflicts between Austria and Serbia already, and Bosnia is always at the center of the conflict. Austria has exerted its influence and control, and they've annexed Bosnia, and Serbia wants Bosnia to be free. So you have people within Serbia who think that the Austrian occupation of Bosnia is a great wrong that needs to be confronted and needs to be undone. You have the Austrians seeing the Serbians as a fundamental threat to the stability of the region. And then you have all these alliances behind that. So when I say that there has to be some little conflict that sucks everybody in, the conflict will be in Bosnia. And that's why we call the Balkans the powder keg of Europe, because all it needs is a match to blow everything up. So now we come to the assassination and the fallout. So if we go to June 28th, 1914, there is an archduke who is arriving in Bosnia to inspect the Austrian troops who are occupying Bosnia. Meanwhile, there's a Serbian nationalist group called the Black Hand who believe that it is wrong for, for Austria to be there. So the Black Hand group, they're radicals. They believe that the best way to deal with Austria is to fight. So what happens is when the Black Hand finds out that the Austrian Archduke is coming to Sarajevo, a city in Bosnia, they plan an assassination against the Archduke. And the fact that it gets pulled off is a great example of how a comedy of errors and something completely unpredictable can be the catalyst for something so big in global history. And the basic story of this is, and if you want, you can kind of scroll ahead if you need to. The basic story is that the Black Hand paces themselves out along the parade route of the Archduke. And there's about 22 conspirators. And they have gotten word of what the parade route will be. The Austrian Archduke, his wife, and an Austrian general will be going along this parade route. So what the Black Hand plans to do is assassinate the Archduke. They have a grenade, they have a revolver, and they have a knife. And that's what each conspirator has. So as the motorcade comes through the streets of Sarajevo, each of those conspirators kind of get cold feet or the car is not going slow enough and they decide not to attempt it until one man throws his grenade at the car. He misses the car, blows up in the crowd, there's chaos, there's mayhem, and very quickly the motorcade drives away. The Archduke, who was scheduled to go speak at a hospital where there were wounded soldiers, he goes to the hospital, gives a speech. When he comes back, the general says, "Look, your life is in danger. It's obvious there's an assassination attempt on your life. We need to get you out of Sarajevo." So, what the Austrian general says is, "We have a new route. Let's get back into the car. We're going to cut the parade short. We're going to just leave." They get back in the car, but nobody tells the driver of the new route. So, when the driver is told to drive, he continues along the same route. Meanwhile, there's a young man, 19 years old. His name is Princip. And Princip is a member of the Black Hand. He's a radical Serbian nationalist who is one of those 22 conspirators. When he saw the initial explosion, he figured the plan had failed. So he had gone into a local cafe got himself a sandwich, and is coming out of the cafe when he sees the Austrian Archduke's motorcade come around. Sorry, I ran out of breath. So here's Princep coming out of the cafe with his lunch in his stomach, and he sees the Austrian car coming up. He takes out his grenade and he throws it. He misses the car, blows up in the crowd, and there's chaos and mayhem and confusion. And inside the car, the general of the Austrian army and the Archduke are yelling at the driver, asking the driver that does he not know the new route for the Archduke to follow. And the driver, amidst all this craziness and confusion, stops the car and backs it up. And he backs it up right in front of Princep. Princep pulls his revolver, shoots into the car, hitting the Archduke in the chest and also hitting his 8-month pregnant wife, Sophia, in her abdomen. Sophie dies on the spot, and the Archduke Ferdinand is pulled from the car as Princep is arrested. Surgeons, in their panic, attempt to cut the shirt away from the chest wound using scalpels that will actually make the problem even worse. And there on the streets of Sarajevo, June 28th, 1914, the Archduke Ferdinand dies. And that is going to set into motion a series of events that will lead to World War I. After the assassination, which shocked the world, Austria blames Serbia. Austria says to Serbia, you encourage these people, you arm these people, you give them intelligence. Serbia goes, we haven't done any such thing. So Austria and Serbia are kind of having a standoff over the assassination. And what happens is Austria says to Serbia, we're giving you an ultimatum, and they give them a series of conditions. One of those conditions is that Serbia allows Austrian officials to enter Serbia and investigate Serbian citizens. That is something Serbia is going to reject, and Austria knows that. What Austria is doing is using the assassination to set up a war with Serbia. And it's sort of like they're going to settle this matter once and for all. And most of the world on June 29th, the day after the assassination, agree with Austria. What's happening is time is progressing, and the international opinion is starting to swing to Serbia's way. And that brings us to the big issue. Serbia has a powerful ally, Russia. Russia and Austria has had tensions before. And what happens is Austria is worried about Russia intervening to support Serbia. So what Austria does is they turn to Germany. And Austria says to Germany, if we go to war with Serbia and Russia intervenes, will you support us? And Germany guarantees Austria support. So Austria and Serbia is in this standoff. Serbia has Russia as an ally. Austria has Germany as an ally. And if you look at number 2, Austria declares war on Serbia. When Serbia rejects the ultimatum, July 28th, 1914, Austria declares war on Serbia. This is your beginning of World War I. What happens is that Russia comes into the conflict and they support Serbia. So Russia quickly declares war on Austria. So now Austria declares war on Serbia, Russia declares war on Austria. And then Germany declares war on Russia and Serbia. So Germany intervenes when Russia intervenes, when Austria declares war on Serbia. And that initial exchanges of declarations of war take place within a day or two of July 28th, 1914. So by July 29th, 1914, essentially, we have these 4 countries now in a conflict that was sparked by the assassination. But as we already know, there was already lingering tensions that led to this. Germany has a worry that France will get involved on Russia's behalf. France and Russia are allies. So what Germany decides to do is they decide to strike France first. So Germany's thinking is that there's a period of time that Russia will need to get fully mobilized for war because Russia is less developed. So it's going to take them longer to get their resources ready to actually fight. And what Germany figures is that they can use that time to conquer France before France can attack Germany. France is Russia's ally. So Germany figures France is getting into this war one way or the other. So we might as well hit them first. And this brings us to the Schlieffen Plan. So the Schlieffen Plan is premised on the idea that Germany should attack France first, and then Germany can turn around and focus on Russia. Because what Germany wants to do is prevent a two-front war. That's not going to go well for them either time in the 20th century. So the other little caveat to the Schlieffen Plan is that Germany will hit France through Belgium. So instead of going straight across the French-German border, the French-German border is heavily fortified. But Belgium is a neutral country. So France has no fortifications along the Belgian border. So what Germany wants to do is occupy the French troops along the French-German border, but then send German troops through Belgium and outflank the French defenses. Belgium has been historically neutral. Britain protects Belgium's neutrality at all costs. So when Germany declares war on France and then sets foot into Belgium, Britain intervenes, declaring war on Germany. And within 1 week, by August 4th, 1914, a conflict between Austria and Serbia has engulfed all of Europe into a war. On one side, you have Austria and Germany, and on the other side, you have Russia, Britain, France, Serbia, and Belgium. And then what will happen is that the Ottoman Empire will join in, and they will join in with Germany. And there's a lot of reasons for this that you don't need to really get into. And then other countries will start getting into the conflict. Japan will declare war on Germany, and they will start taking German colonies throughout Asia. Italy will just kind of stay out of it at the beginning. The United States will enter much later. But basically, what we want to know is how this war gets started in 1914. Now, here's the thing. The AP people probably aren't going to drill you this much on this detail. But to me, I think it's important to keep in mind because it shows us what happens when an aggressive military policy is being followed, that nations forget what a war truly entails, and they get themselves in over their heads. Throughout the 19th century, these problems were often solved through diplomacy. Now in the 20th century, war is going to be the new form of diplomacy. And that's going to take us to a new style of war. So, with that, I'm going to go through one more thing. If you were to stop now, you would have everything you need for the quiz. However, if you would like the beginnings of World War I explained to you with the analogy of a playground, please stick around. So, let's set the stage. We have an elementary school. Actually, we'll say, yes, an elementary school, but we're old school elementary here, sixth graders. Now, within these sixth graders, we have, a group of kids. The SGA president, the all-around straight A student, the good boy, the boy next door, the boy that every mom wants her daughter to marry. That boy is Great Britain. Great Britain is the star soccer player. Great Britain is the star student. Great Britain is the leader. Okay, you got them. And then you've got another kid named Germany. Now, Germany is the vice president of SGA. Germany, a little bit aggressive, little bit of a inferiority complex. Looking at Britain, kind of jealous of Britain's popularity. But Germany is popular in its own right. Now, Germany, a long time ago, in 1871, had a fight with France on the playground. And France and Germany have bitter feelings towards each other. We call this the Franco-Prussian War. Now, Germany and France is an interesting kid because France is always alone. So Britain's got all its friends. Germany's got its friends, but France, for the most part, they just sit on a swing on the playground by themselves because what Germany has done is made it so that nobody hangs out with France because Germany always worries that France will want some revenge. Germany can handle France one on one, but Germany cannot handle France if France has friends joining in. So you've got Germany, popular kid starting to get jealous of how much attention Britain gets. Britain, the super popular kid of sixth grade, not looking for a fight, perfectly happy with his good status. And then you got France sitting on a swing by themselves. Nobody will play with them. Now, we go to the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is kind of leaving school behind and leaving good pencils, good color pencils, good stuff. And two kids want, actually, I apologize. Let me rephrase that analogy. The Ottoman Empire has left the school and they've moved on to middle school. And behind is the Ottoman Empire's ex-girlfriend, a girlfriend named Bosnia. Now there's two boys who want to date Bosnia. Bosnia is a sweet girl. Austria wants to date Bosnia. Serbia wants to date Bosnia. So you've got this tension between Austria and Serbia, and they both want to date. They both want to date Bosnia. So Germany knows this. So what Germany tries to do is hang out with both Austria and with Serbia and tries to keep them relatively happy. And he also pulls in Russia. Now, Russia is Serbia's cousin. And Russia, not the smartest kid in the school, but one of the biggest kids in the school. He's not quick, but he is strong. And nobody really screws around with Russia, but lately Russia has lost a couple of fights, and everybody knows this. So Russia, big kid, known to be strong, but known to be slow as well. Let's be honest. But Russia is cousins with Serbia. Austria is good friends with Germany. Now, what's happening is that as Germany is starting to get more and more jealous of Britain, Germany hangs out with Austria more and more. And Russia feels left out. So what happens is Russia starts to hang out with France. And all of a sudden, France has somebody to play with them on the playground. And France is overjoyed. So France and Russia are now hanging out. Germany and Austria are hanging out more and more. Austria and Serbia are fighting over a girl named Bosnia. Now, I should mention here somewhere that Italy has always been kind of a bully towards France. So Italy hangs out with Germany and Austria, but Italy's starting to go, wow, Germany and Austria is getting a little too aggressive for my taste. And then you have Britain. Now, Britain, popular kid, is noticing that Germany is like always getting in his business. Anytime Britain does something wrong, Germany tells the teacher. Anytime Britain gets into a discussion, Germany always steps in and starts the argument on the other side. Britain starts to show up with a new haircut. Sure enough, next day Germany's got a new haircut. Britain shows up with the most, the most popular shirt. Germany shows up with the most popular shirt the next day. And Britain's looking at Germany, why are you doing everything I'm doing? And Germany goes, hey, I'm just doing my thing. And by the way, I told teacher the other day that you were pushing around those boors kids, in the third grade. So the tension is mounting between Germany and Britain. France and Russia see this. France doesn't like Germany. France gets it in their head, hey, I can get two friends. So France starts to say, hey, Britain, come on over, hang out with us. So now Austria and Germany are hanging out together, all laughing at France and everybody else. Britain, France, and Russia are kind of hanging out with each other, looking at, Germany going, he's getting a little too big for his britches. I think somebody needs to put him in his place. Serbia, Russia's cousin, is trying to date Bosnia, whereas Austria is starting to date Bosnia. Now we bring to ourselves to Belgium. Belgium is the weird kid. Belgium is the kid who has read Harry Potter one too many times, shows up in his wizard's capes, has his own wand, is always telling the class about new spells. But everybody leaves Belgium alone because Belgium is good friends with Britain. Britain and Belgium grew up next door to each other. Britain always liked Belgium ever since they were little kids. Britain always has Belgium's back. So one day, Austria is going to prompose to Bosnia, because in sixth grade they have proms already at that point. So let's rephrase that. The sixth grade equivalent of prom, which I believe we call the winter dance, is going on. And Austria plans this big proposal for Bosnia. So he brings in this wonderful flower display and he puts it down, he leaves it. Serbia sneaks in and just destroys the whole thing. Austria is outraged at Serbia. They've been fighting over Bosnia for some time. So Austria comes up to Serbia and says, "You did that. I know you did it." And Serbia goes, "Hey, look, you didn't see me do it. Nobody else saw me do it. So I didn't do it." So Serbia and Austria are squaring off over the damage that Serbia did to the winter dance proposal. I'm making some of this analogy up on the spot. So what happens is that Austria wants to fight Serbia. They're done with it. They're going to go after school on the playground and they're going to settle this. But Serbia has Russia as a big brother. So Austria turns to Germany. They go, "Hey, look, I'm going to punch Serbia in its mouth. If Russia steps in to punch me, you going to protect me from Russia?" And Germany says, "Austria, I've got your back. I will protect you no matter what happens." So they all meet at the playground. All the kids come into the playground. Okay. And here's how it all sets up. You've got Serbia and Austria face to face in the middle, exchanging insults, demanding things. Austria is saying to Serbia, "I want you to pay for the damage you did to my flower arrangement." And Serbia goes, "That ultimatum, I'm not doing that ultimatum." So they're squaring off. Meanwhile, Russia has come into the picture, and Russia's standing next to Austria to kind of protect Serbia. So they're not stepping necessarily in Serbia's way. They're kind of getting ready to jump Austria. So we've got Serbia, we've got Austria, we've got Russia right here. And then Germany sneaks in kind of behind Serbia. So Germany's keeping an eye on Russia. Russia's keeping an eye on Austria. Austria and Serbia are arguing. Meanwhile, France is stepping behind Germany. Okay. And Britain is kind of watching this from a distance, not from a great distance. Italy, who's been hanging out with Austria and Germany, is slowly backing away because they realize that this is not going to be good. And Belgium is kind of casting spells and spinning around kind of randomly. What happens is that Austria punches Serbia. Serbia punches back. Russia steps up to wind up. Germany says, "Hey, Russia, don't you do anything." And then Germany turns around and goes to punch France. But instead of punching France straight in the face, Germany is going to do a hook. And in the process of hooking, Belgium, who has been spinning around casting invisibility spells, gets punched. That outrages Britain. Britain jumps on Germany. France jumps on Germany. Russia is still moving into the picture. Austria and Serbia are wrestling. The Ottoman Empire hears all about this from seventh grade, junior high. He comes back to the elementary school, jumps on the side of the German and the Austrians. Italy takes even more steps back. And then a new kid comes into the school, the United States. And while all this is happening, the United States is looking out the window going, "I don't know quite what to do with this." And that, folks, is your playground analogy of the beginnings of World War I. I hope that helped made a little more sense of it. Again, is it going to pop up on the AP World History exam? Maybe not, but it's definitely something you should know. So in the meantime, as always, bring your questions to the classroom, and I will see you for the next lecture, which is the effects of World War I. Bye.